Okay, it looks like we are live for the OpenJS Foundation's monthly AMA, where we chat with projects and community folks about the cool things that they are working on. This month, we are super excited to bring on the Dojo project. And before I hand it over to Dylan, who will be our moderator for today, for those tuning in, please feel free to either drop your questions into the YouTube chat, or you can also at us, or direct your questions to us on Twitter at OpenJSF. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dylan.
Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Dylan. I'm one of the co-founders of Dojo. I've been working with Dojo for the past, like 16 years now. And we have Ant here, Ant Gubler. Ant waved, yep. Ant is co-maintainer of Modern Dojo, co-architect of it with Matt Gadd. And Ant is a software engineer at SitePen and lives in the UK. And I'm the CEO at Living Spec, and I live in Arizona, though it looks like I'm hanging out in the Northern Lights area, which is really pleasant and nice and cool. So yeah, thanks for joining us. Let's kick things off. I think we'll start just giving a brief glimpse of Dojo and where we are today and how we got here. So Dojo actually started in 2004, which is many lifetimes ago in terms of JavaScript frameworks and toolkits and whatnot. And we started the project because we needed it. We wanted to sort of fix browsers and fix compatibility issues and treat JavaScript as sort of a real programming environment. At the time, it really was not. And it was kind of started at a very good time, the time when sort of Google Maps and Gmail came out the same year, and they were working on apps that were later coined as Ajax applications, which quickly came to mean like anything interesting in a browser. So it kind of like super consumed all JavaScript applications at the time. And there was a lot of buzz and a lot of interest, but it was super early and browsers were broken and JavaScript had limits. I mean, this was years before mobile devices and years before ES6 and TypeScript and all the sorts of things we take for granted. At the time, Dojo co-founder Alex Russell had a project called NetWindows. And one of the questions we were asked was why the name Dojo? And so in 2004, Alex received a cease and desist order from Microsoft over the name Windows in the project NetWindows, and had to choose a new name because he didn't want to pay the cost or couldn't afford to pay the cost of defending a lawsuit against Microsoft at the time. And I don't think they would do that today. They've changed a lot. Maybe they would, I don't know. But it made us realize how terrible we were at naming things. And so we were exchanging a lot of really bad names. And one of the names, funny enough, was actually Node at the time. And that's a terrible name. No one would want to call their project Node. That sounds like a cancerous disease. So we rejected that name. And we had names like Shiny Marbles and Modular and just random stuff. And one person proposed the DHTML Justice League, which tells you like how obscure things were back then. Like DHTML was a phrase we would use with a straight face at the time. And Leonard Lin said, how about Dojo? You know, you're all like sort of these JavaScript kung fu like experts, ninjas, whatever. And Dojo has like D and J for like dynamic JavaScript. So what about that? And everyone was like, well, that's way better than the name we can come up with. And so that's been the name ever since. And we've thought about changing the name as Dojo has changed, and we're just not very good at names. So we're good about once every 20 years. So maybe someday we'll come up with another name. But for now, that's sort of how we came to the name Dojo. And around 2004 is when we first started the project. 2005 is when we shipped our 0.1. 2007 was 1.0. And around 2010 or 11, we started talking about Dojo 2. And like many things, sort of like your, I don't know, like your Duke Nukem Forever or Quake 2, or just sequels are really hard, right? And so we had this challenge of we were providing all this stuff that mattered for users of browsers that included like IE 6 through 8. And that's very different than sort of the types of frameworks we use today. And so it took us a long time to sort of wait out the need for Dojo 1 to sort of slow down and wane and die off, though usage is still there, so it hasn't really truly died. It's just I don't think anyone would choose old Dojo to build a new application. And so we started thinking about what modern Dojo should be, because we didn't want to just like sort of port this massive set of modules and into modern syntax and call it good. We wanted to really rethink and say, what do people need from a framework today? And for us, that changed and evolved. And it took us probably, when did we ship? Like 2018 was 2.0?
About April 2018, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it took us a long time and many rewrites, but we wanted to really not like give like pain to our users. We wanted to give like nice ergonomics and use modern features and align with modern standards and provide sort of the smallest, simplest, most flexible, but yet comprehensive for building an application framework we could give people. So we spent a lot of time, Matt in particular, but the whole team, just trying to put together a framework that took the things we like from the current ecosystem, whether that's sort of standards or things other frameworks do nicely that we wanted to sort of look at, perhaps improve. We really love TypeScript, but we didn't want to just say, hey, we wrote it in TypeScript, here you go. Because if you've used TypeScript at any length, you sort of know that TypeScript is not like just, hey, it just works for every possible complex thing you can describe, but it actually takes effort to provide a framework that gives nice ergonomics for use of TypeScript. And so we took our time and we tried to get things right. And then we've been iterating ever since. So we're already up to Dojo version 7 and we're working on version 8 now. So Ant, maybe I can shut up a little bit and let you tell us a bit about modern Dojo and what you love about it.
I have to say, I love Dojo. I guess that's it. I think you hit the nail on the head there. So like for us, it's been a challenge. Obviously, we shipped the first release of modern Dojo, Dojo 2 in April 2018. I think at the time, TypeScript, from the inception of wanting to use TypeScript for the next version of Dojo to actually releasing like TypeScript has come on so leaps and bounds. But even so, it was still difficult to do to describe certain types and scenarios in TypeScript. Like 2018, over the last 2 and a bit years, we've been progressively trying to change things that and make our framework more ergonomic for users, so to lower the boundaries for people who are coming on board with Dojo, to make it easier for them to understand, to get started. That's kind of very important for us, especially we want to target not just hobbyists, but we want Dojo to be kind of the batteries included, opinionated framework that is out the box and works for kind of the hobbyists through to kind of the enterprise users that have got big teams and are building complicated applications, let's say, in the browser. And I think over the last 2 years, some of the improvements we've made in the ecosystem of Dojo, and that's through from kind of the base APIs or the primitives of building widgets through to kind of the routing system and the stores and some of the concepts we've built on top of that, which are looking to deal with kind of like how you interact with kind of remote resources, async requests, like requesting data from a server and dealing with that in a nice reactive way within your widgets is very important to reduce kind of, again, the boilerplate involved and the overhead involved of knowledge, of understanding of how to put these things together. So for me, Dojo, we're always working on Dojo to make it easier, lower the kind of the knowledge required to get started. And I think that's, with Dojo 8, we're looking to kind of kick on with one of our concepts, which is resources, which gives kind of the power to a user to have that asynchronous kind of data available within a widget and globally cached it across your whole application without having to deal with kind of how that data is stored and how to manage whether or not it's loading and all the different states that you get with that kind of data.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, for people who used Dojo Toolkit before, modern Dojo is pretty much as different as switching to React or Angular or Vue, and it's a completely new modern framework. But it does share some lineage and history with some patterns. Like obviously Dojo had a build system. We have a build system that we leverage Webpack under the covers, but we try not to expose the specifics of dependencies to most users. Modern Dojo has sort of the old style has feature detection system in a modern way that is integrated with the build system and runtime behavior and so forth. And Dojo also has some really nice stuff that Dojo 1 never could have even thought of doing, like static generation, or what we call build time rendering, where we have access to sort of Node.js modules and dependencies at build time, so we can compile static sites and use sort of simple like modern APIs but generate really powerful stuff. But I think so I touched on much things there, but I think it's kind of interesting to help people realize like a lot of modern frameworks on the surface feel really similar. Like if you squint, like they have components or widgets, they have render functions, they have routing or routing systems, they have a build system. But I feel like Dojo does just some subtle things that are nice, that are a little different, where you can do anything with any framework, but Dojo kind of just gives you this really nice lean layer of like do the right thing efficiently. And part of it, I think, is it benefits from coming after React and after Angular, and we have sort of a smaller API footprint. And also, like when I compare Dojo to React, I'm like, Dojo is like React, and like they use JSX as the primary mechanism for defining components. But when I go to do something with Dojo, there's kind of typically one way to do it. There's not like this myriad of, do I use hooks? Do I use like these various patterns that have emerged over time? Part of that is Dojo is a bit newer, but also I think Dojo has said, like, let's try to think about how these problems fit together and what's the right ergonomic way to do them, rather than kind of like, well, there's 20 ways, go figure it out yourself, which is certainly something you could do. But like, do you find that like when people are first learning about modern Dojo and trying to use it, and the questions they're asking, do you feel like they're struggling with the like, which way do I do things? Or like, what are the kind of typical like new user questions that come up with Dojo?
That's a good question. We've got a Discord channel, and so we get quite a lot of engagement with people who are just trying out Dojo. Normally, just for your hobby projects, and it's not. I think where we want to consistently improve is to complement kind of the framework, and what we believe is a very very easy way to build web applications is to keep our documentation on Dojo.io kind of up to date to help people get started with Dojo. And I think we did a massive revamp of that early this year. I think it coincided with was it early this year or last year?
6 or 7.
Six, I think it was actually was 6. So it was like I think it was like August last year.
Feels like yesterday, doesn't it?
And that's hugely important to us, for people to have kind of that point of reference. And one of the big, one of the hardest things I find personally is actually writing good documentation. So most of the feedback we get, or most of the questions we get, aren't like, oh, how do I do this? There's just so many ways. It's I want to do something, I want to do X, and how can I do this? Dojo has an opinionated way, and we obviously can point them to the documentation, but sometimes I think that's where the failure is it's not quite as clear as it could be for people to get started without having to ask that question. And that's where really that kind of feedback, and whenever we receive that feedback, we try and address that in documentation, so that next time someone who comes along finds Dojo, they have a smoother kind of onboarding process to that.
Yeah, a lot of times, like when we used to do a lot of Dojo workshops back in the Dojo 1 days, people said that like the main benefit of training was to actually learn how to ask good questions, because they needed to know like enough of the vocabulary to know like how to ask the thing they were trying to do, rather than, sometimes there's just so many terms you're not familiar with or you don't know about, you don't know where to start. I think, so another interesting historical thing. So Dojo was probably one of the first, maybe not the first, but one of the first frameworks or toolkits that had the idea of a widget library or a component system, and that was known as Digit back in the day. And some of the early members of the Digit team went on to work on the custom elements or web components standards process, right? And obviously that's grown a lot and changed a lot since then. But there are early traces and hints of like what Dojo did became sort of what custom elements did, with a lot of iteration and feedback. And the custom elements have kind of had a pretty slow uptake in general compared to some other things on the web. And part of it was, I think it took a while to sort of get the ergonomics of that right. I think there's still some work there to do. But Dojo embraces custom elements as an option for both importing and exporting widgets. The idea being like, hey, we don't want to lock you into Dojo. If you build a component with Dojo and you want to put it into an application that can understand custom elements, that should be possible and viable. What's your feeling about this is a user question, the current state of custom elements? Are they the future, or are there still significant problems to really make them take off on a level where every framework would just wrap custom elements?
Yeah. So the current state of custom elements, that's a bigger question. I think
it is.
The first question was how important are custom elements to Dojo? And for me, I think it's been clear since even the initial release of Modern Dojo, custom elements has been a really important part of the Dojo story for us. And like Dylan said, it was never just about being able to use custom elements within kind of Dojo, because some frameworks even struggle with that. It was also about actually being able to kind of generate custom elements from your Dojo widgets. So if you build a widget library in your company, or just for funsies on the side, you can actually we want that to be able to be used by anybody in any framework, and lower those boundaries between the frameworks, and get that interop working between Dojo and the community and the wider just the web in general. So it's been clear from version 2 that that's been super important to us. And I think even in the initial release we had a way of generating or compiling custom elements from your Dojo widgets. And over the last 2 years, it's been something that we've been working on to provide like even more powerful options with and support with Dojo custom elements to support scenarios that you build into your widgets. So, for example, widgets that accept children, widgets that have complicated kind of property types that get passed to them, or property data types that, and now and obviously in a HTML world that becomes difficult to work with in a declarative way. You find yourself having to kind of create the element and then get a handle to the element in some JavaScript, and then set some properties on it with the data it requires. Whereas ideally, what we want people to be able to use is import that widget as a script into their HTML, and then use their widget directly without having to do any JavaScript. And over the last 2 years, there's been some significant kind of improvements in our support for the output that we actually compile from widgets. And that's we support the concept of children, of widget children, and we support the concept of kind of the complex like non-primitive types that can get passed. If there's a widget that requires an object, you can pass in a stringified version of that, and so you can still use the widget in a declarative manner. And Dojo and the wrapper that Dojo provides around that will automatically know what to do with it. And equally on the building side of things, we've moved on from having to have kind of some wrapping configuration just to describe what the properties and what the custom element should be output as, and we've kind of leveraged that the type system from TypeScript to determine and introspect each widget and be able to generate kind of the custom element kind of wrapper, and with all of the configuration, with all of the properties and attribute types based upon kind of those interfaces that you create with your widget, hopefully making it kind of a seamless process that you can just you can use the build widget tool to build your library for consumption in a Dojo application, or you can use it to kind of output a full library in kind of custom elements.
Yeah. one of the challenges I remember, like early in the day, there was this concept of like HTML imports with web components, which was beneficial in that, like, if you were going to have 100 web components in a page and they shared a framework, you could sort of just load the code that was a dependency for the framework once for all of them. But then that was deprecated because it was kind of duplicative with ES modules, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge for us for a while was, well, you know, Dojo is pretty small, but it's not that small. And if you have to load all of Dojo and you have like a bunch of web components in a page, that's going to slow down your application. Have they made progress to address that problem yet? Or is that still sort of a work in progress?
I mean, that's something that we are looking to kind of build ourselves with the support with that Dojo provides. You're right in what you're saying at the moment. If you build a library of custom element widgets from Dojo, the Dojo is effectively packaged in every single one of those. It's not a large library. I mean, we come in, at kind of a minimum, 15 to 20 like kilobytes, but it is certainly something as you put in like hundreds of different custom elements on your page, you're going to feel the pain of that. And I think we wanted to address this for Dojo 8. We might still get around to it, but a concept of actually being able to not just, so at the moment you have to import all of your all of the individual output widgets. You have to actually load the scripts themselves each time. So we're looking at kind of leveraging kind of some of the build tooling that we use to generate the custom elements so you only need to include a script once, and then as you use the widgets, it will lazily load kind of just the wrappers required for that widget. So the core of the framework will be included once in a page, and then everything else will just lazily get loaded in as required, rather than having to kind of specify all the scripts and all the CSS within that single page. So I think that will significantly reduce that footprint that you could have if you had like a large app using like multiple custom elements, but it will also kind of provide you with kind of that lazy loading and the ergonomics of not having to kind of include 400 different script tags and CSS and then deal with all that.
Yeah. Every time you mention CSS, I'm reminded that that's often like the biggest pain point for people in the modern web stack, because we take the time to really learn JavaScript, and then CSS is just kind of the thing we learn just enough of to be productive, and then we try to avoid it the rest of the time.
Tell me about it. Yeah.
I know, right? And I mean, one of the things, so I've spent a fair amount of time using React as well, and I feel like every time I import someone else's component, they've taken a different approach to styling that component. So I'm sort of managing like 20, well, it came out with 20, but at least 5 different ways of potentially styling a component. Some of it's CSS and JS, some of it's like a JSX style tag, some of it components use themes, some of it other mechanisms as well. And Dojo has some pretty interesting features, I think, which I'll let you explain in a moment. But also, one of the nice things I think with Dojo 7 was we added support for material design components as well. So maybe just talk at a real high level about how you typically style things with Dojo, and then maybe talk about that material design work.
Yeah, so like with Dojo, we early on we made the decision to kind of go with CSS modules as the recommended and supported way of building and styling widgets. It provided us with all the protection that we wanted in terms of encapsulating your styles for a widget, making sure there was no clashes between widgets, so you didn't inadvertently affect a widget somewhere else in your application by making a change. And it gave us that kind of encapsulation that we needed. And it also gave us some really nice, because with using TypeScript, we were able to generate, the typings required for each of the CSS files. So as you imported your CSS, and you used your CSS like class names, you could actually do that via the import of the CSS module, and it gave you the typings of all the class names you needed. So it kind of gave us, it was a win for kind of the ergonomics while developing, to ensure that you didn't mistype a style, but it also gave us all of the kind of the behavior that we needed or wanted from kind of a component or a widget scoped CSS.
Yeah.
So that's really good. And as Dylan said, is, you know, with obviously there's like, if someone else wanted to come out, go away and do their own kind of styles, you know, do styling in their own way with Dojo, I mean, that would be more than possible. But obviously the recommended way and the built-in support we have with all our build tooling is to use the CSS module pattern, which comes out the box with Dojo, and with Dojo widgets that, you know, in Dojo 7 basically had a huge overhaul. It was the biggest, probably the biggest thing in Dojo 7. It was to, we basically took an approach where we needed to kind of not start again, but we needed to kind of understand and get patterns kind of, you know, straightforward and aligned across the whole of the project, because it kind of over between versions 2 and 6 it had evolved organically, you know, with different contributors without kind of necessarily all of the rails that we wanted to give people, not just internally for ourselves of building that library, but also equally kind of the example we wanted to set for people who wanted to build widgets with Dojo. So we kind of reset there, and as part of that, we also provided that material theme and the concept of the variants. So, you know, you can swap the theme at runtime. You can swap the variants at runtimes, and the variants in this case would be, you know, light and dark, or, you know, whatever variants that you want to create, because you can actually you can take, and that's all using like CSS variables, which is also supported back to IE8 with some trickery from Dojo.
IE8, wow, really?
Yeah. No, IE11, my bad.
11,
my bad, IE11. We don't support IE8. IE11's the...
No, good. I was a little scared.
Bad,
I was like, who went rogue on me with that?
Yeah, so IE11, which is good. So that was another key thing of things. What a key aspect of building Dojo is to make sure that even though we do provide some kind of nice syntactic sugar over the top for people who don't want or need to support IE11, we do at the moment still consider IE11 in everything that we do, from the build tooling to kind of the theming to stores to the base widget authoring. Everything is kind of thought of and made sure that it's kind of compatible across the board.
Yeah, there was a nice change where we went from providing shims by default to only for browsers that needed them. And basically what we did is made IE11 users pay the performance penalty of supporting modern APIs like intersection observers or resize observers, or even web components themselves, rather than bundling that to everyone, even when it wasn't needed.
It kind of goes even further than that at the moment. And it goes, so when Modern Dojo was first released 2 years ago, like Dylan just said, is we effectively included all of the shims in as the default, and our modern build was a flag that people had to know about and request when they built their application, and that was basically what, you know, we had a bunch of kind of like flags that told our build system, you know, how what to kind of align at build time, because it wasn't necessary, it wasn't needed. So the first thing we did is we switched that round. So the default was you know, for the modern browser, and if you wanted to support kind of IE11 and you needed all of these, you know, basically shims that Dojo can provide, then you have to use a flag. And that basically, so that will support, that's, you know, that's supporting the modern, and that's kind of that we kind of changed to like our approach there to make it modern first. We want to be as modern as possible, keeping up with the standards, and then obviously there will be people who need to have that kind of legacy support, and at that point that they can use a legacy flag. And then subsequent to that, we actually started kind of doing loading kind of some of the poly or shims that we provide, like Dylan mentioned, intersection observer, resize observer, even fetch, kind of at runtime. So we determined that at runtime, we built them into separate bundles that weren't included in your application unless you needed them, unless the user needed them, because they were using, you know, resize observer. when it wasn't, but I don't know what it is now, but certainly wasn't in sort of
Yeah.
the old Edge. And so if you had an application that was using our resize observer, our shim, then it would only load that if the user was actually using Edge or was actually using a browser that kind of required it. And I think that's kind of it's similar to kind of that differential loading pattern, which we haven't quite got to yet, but we are working and hoping to get towards that, so it's even more seamless for our users.
Yeah. Coming back to some of the CSS stuff, I just remember how magical it was when we first got what I would describe as like our theming right. And there were a few things that were kind of cool. So CSS modules, in some ways you could argue it removes the C from CSS, but it's more like it removes the unexpected cascading of styles across things, right? But it just saves you like a little bit of time. So like what you're doing is like you're typing up your component, typically in JSX, and you're like writing class name equals. And when you put your like quotes into place, your IDE is giving you a drop-down list of the class names that are allowed because you've explicitly imported which like theme file is relevant for that particular component, which is kind of cool. And then the other thing that it's doing that's nice is when you're in like your inspector or debugger or browser dev tools, whatever you want to call them, and you're looking at that node, what you're seeing is like a hash, the name of the class name, and then like a hash after it. So what it's doing is it's protecting it from and keeping it unique, but it's still human readable in the middle. So in your code, you're using the human readable name, like as you would expect. And in your debugger, you can still sort of tell what that name was. There's just some extra stuff around it to protect it, which is kind of, at the time it seemed magical. I mean, maybe everyone knows that now, but yeah.
Also, obviously the source maps worked as well. So not only that, is in like when you're in your dev tools, you could click on you could click on your style and you could see the actual like your source CSS, which is obviously super important for those developer ergonomics, which
so what's the like biggest app you've seen built with Modern Dojo? Because I mean, I think I've seen some stuff that's pretty cool, but like in terms of like breadth and scope, do you think there's any limits, or have you seen just like pretty much anything you could build in front-end JavaScript you could build with Modern Dojo?
I mean, I haven't heard anyone trying to build something in Dojo and not being able to, if that's the question. SitePen, SitePen, we've used Dojo on a number of kind of big, customer projects, which, and by big, I mean, I don't know whether it matters how many modules, but then, thousands of modules within that application, with no kind of, and so because we've been able to do that and basically dog food, Dojo in SitePen, we've had feedback from our own engineers, where the pain points are, how some suggestions on like where the boilerplate is as well, to make things easier for us to actually kind of work on and improve, and that's where kind of some of the more recent patterns have come about. We've had support this year. We've had a concept of a global application store, since the initial release, and that's not really changed a significant amount. There's been some small enhancements that have been made across the board, but not conceptually, it's not really changed. It's like if you need kind of some application state, then you use stores, and then you can create your own. You can interact with your whatever remote resources you need to get it asynchronously using fetch or whatever, and then put them in the store, and your widgets will kind of re-render and use that information when it's available within the actual application store. And some of our more recent concepts have been to try and, but there's a lot of boilerplate with that. You have to create kind of, if you're talking like in comparison to kind of some of the other like well-known kind of application state stores like Redux, you have to create your like the concept of your kind of action stroke reducers, and you have to manage kind of like the structure of that data and how it's stored, so that you can get information like whether something's loading or is in progress or is failed, or like the pagination, so what page you're on, any of the meta information, and that's in general, that's quite a lot of work, and it shouldn't necessarily need to be. And so
I think that's why we see somewhat of a proliferation of React frameworks lately trying to solve some of those problems, because like they're just kind of unanswered or open-ended questions for most people, and it's where we see a lot of people run into challenges in that space. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's all right. Well, we've seen the same thing, like internally to Sidepen, and equally like on Discord, where people have, you know, had challenges in dealing with these kind of common scenarios. And that's where kind of our, you know, the new concept that got released in Dojo 7, which is resources. That's where we're hoping that comes in to play to help people like manage those kind of application interactions, or, you know, and dealing with application data without having to worry about those, you know, the boilerplate required and all of the machinery you need to put in place in order to actually kind of get that to be all wired together within your application. All of our widgets that are effectively can use are powered by data, like our lists, apart from the grid, our lists and our type of heads and everything like that. They all now, as of Dojo 7, they all use resources. That's what powers them. And it gives us a really nice kind of common API across all of our widgets to author in, and gives all our consumers a really nice pattern to be able to use the same kind of approach and same data within their application across multiple widgets.
So that reminds me a lot of what used to be like Dojo stores or D stores, even though it's not the same in terms of like having a shared API that lets you interact with your data, rather than a like the shared API for managing like the application state, which is more like Redux or MobX or today's Dojo store. It'd probably help if you feel like it to just sort of compare like you did a little bit comparing Redux with Dojo store, which is kind of like operations transforms processes, and it feels like there's a pretty clean way to do things and there's less boilerplate. I don't know if you've used MobX much, or if you'd compare it or contrast it with that, or if that's just a bad question and I should move on.
No, it's fine. I mean, conceptually, they do the same thing. You know, like there would be no point us coming up with a solution for application state, because Redux isn't kind of React specific, obviously, neither is MobX necessarily. There'd be no point with us coming up with kind of a state solution or a store solution in Dojo if it was kind of just a copy. And so that's where we started 2 years ago, when we were kind of thinking about what we wanted a global application store to be. And we actually went with a pattern called, with using JSON patch to apply changes, and with obviously the stipulation that, you know, the store should be effectively serializable, and with that, it opens up kind of, for us, it opened up a lot of power in terms of giving us the ability to perform those kind of reducing actions automatically for a user based upon those changes, those operations that a user basically creates and returns from our store commands. And it also enabled us to kind of support out the box without kind of having any additional like middleware or like machinery to support async commands, so that, you know, there's not two ways of doing things. There's a single way of doing things. You return operations to Dojo, and Dojo will manipulate and change the store based on those operations. And that was kind of, for us, is it opened up a load of potential future ideas and abstractions to build on the store. You know, we can serialize and deserialize, you know, our state to local storage automatically. We can support out the box things like undo and redo by applying applying the reverse of an operation that we can obviously we can determine. So they kind of opened a lot of you know potential future features, and some of which we haven't actually got round to. So, you know, there's plenty to kind of work on there in terms of the store, and resources is
definitely we've always got more to do, right?
And resources designed not necessarily to replace the store, because there will be transient state in the UI that doesn't really map to a resource, and so And if that's kind of global and required across your application, then this, you might find yourself using a mixture of resources and the store. But it is designed to kind of, at the moment, it really it does read by default. It does read at the moment only, so there's no persistence or modification APIs but they will be coming in 8 in order to kind of. But it does support by default out of the box kind of concept of pagination, querying, all the things that you would expect to be working with when you're working with, a resource API. And so therefore, it provides kind of all of the meta information you need, and you can access that within your widget without, with a consistent API, which works in a reactive way. And
yeah, I kind of like, they're not the same, but there's definitely some overlap and parallelisms between like how React hooks make it so a lot of things don't need Redux, like simpler applications don't need Redux anymore, don't need to think about that. And how, but like Dojo also has this concept of middleware, and it has resources, and it has stores, and React kind of has this concept of hooks, and then you could use Redux or MobX. And there's some similarities, but also I think there's some more distinction and delineation. But also like Dojo's middleware sort of fills the gap for like React's references, and as well as things you might use for hooks, and resources then kind of ties into that spot where you might have a hook that tries to manage application state without having a Redux store behind it or something.
Yeah, I mean hooks and contexts are effectively kind of the primitives that people are building kind of custom hooks, to support Redux and things like that. So they've obviously got their use state, and that's a primitive hook that that React provides. But with the concept of the context and being able to build on hooks, build hooks on hooks. That's where kind of Redux have been able to build their own hooks, which for me, ergonomic wise, it's so much nicer to do that. Hooks were game changing for React, in my opinion, in terms of the ergonomics. I think most people are kind of come around to that now. And for Dojo, middleware, because we talked about resources, we've talked about quite a few things in terms of theming, but middleware is not, I wouldn't want to compare it to hooks, but it's an equivalent machinery that we have for Dojo, that is the primitive that you can build kind of some shared logic that you can use within your widget, that gets injected in your widget, which can maintain kind of references across renders, for example, which obviously with widgets being effectively just a function that gets called, that's something that Dojo, like React, manages kind of in their reconciler, or whichever part the project is, library is. And so resources is a middleware, is a core middleware that Dojo provides, and we provide quite a few core middlewares. We have something called an iCache, which is I would say that's very similar to kind of the use state hook. It's a way to maintain and manage state across renders locally to that widget. It's called an iCache because it actually stands for invalidating cache, because when it changes, it will invalidate your widget and re-render. That's the Dojo concepts. We have hooks for theming and internationalization, which we haven't really touched on, and we have, did I say hooks? I meant middleware.
I know, I was going to laugh at that, but you stole my joke. Yeah.
We have middleware for some of the cooler kind of aspects of Dojo. So we have like intersection observer middleware. We have middleware for resize observer. I'm just trying to think without looking.
Now there's a lot of them. We have things for focus events and other stuff like that. Yeah. One of the things that I like about Dojo from a naming perspective is these things that are intended to be middleware aren't all prefixed with the word use. Like they're kind of called what they are, which to me is a plus. But also I think that it was just part of the design of the framework. And so like hooks to me feel like something that kind of had to be carefully designed around what React was already doing, and to not break all the different did component mount and like all the other stuff that was already there. And so like if you've used React forever, it just kind of feels straightforward. But if you're new to React, you're like, wait, why is this thing using connect and this thing using component did mount and this thing using use selector or use state or whatever? And it's pretty easy to like get confused because there are so many examples like that. Or even you pull in a dependency and it's using the old way and you're like, oh, what is this stuff doing? I don't get it, right? And so there's not as much of that in my experience with Dojo. One of the things that's kind of interesting is, so there are things we tried in modern Dojo that we ended up just not needing as much of. One thing we tried early on was wrapping like the equivalent of, first we had RxJS in Dojo, and then we switched to trying to wrap the observable shim. And then we also had we thought we needed a lot of reducer stuff, and we thought we might need streams, and we kind of ended up not needing any of those things because I feel like we just wrote APIs that were like, where they needed to be reactive, they were reactive. Where we needed to reduce things, we reduced them. So it wasn't like we needed to bolt those things onto the framework. They just were.
I mean, I think you kind of touched on it there. I don't think necessarily it was the APIs because, early Dojo, I think we all made mistakes in terms of some of the APIs we opened up and some of the APIs we designed. But fundamentally, we hope that we got the pattern right, the reactive pattern right, which meant that you didn't need kind of any of that kind of the RxJS kind of patterns for in Dojo. There are obviously absolutely times and places to use kind of RxJS and the observable patterns, but with the kind of the top down reactive kind of property passing, it wasn't necessary. So obviously we played with it. We kind of got a feeling for whether or not that would improve Dojo. And if we don't need it and we don't need to depend on an external library, that's great for us. That's kind of, if you look at Dojo itself, it's there's minimal kind of external dependencies required, and mostly they're kind of shims for like intersection observer and things like that we kind of wrap, and that gives us the power to basically like conditionally include them for certain users, rather than make it so that users have to include that themselves. So I mean, obviously over the last 2 years, as we moved away from using kind of TypeScript classes, that gave us 2 years ago a lot of the power we needed in order to actually kind of describe APIs and infer kind of properties for widgets, typing wise, via like a form of generic, to kind of a more functional approach, trying to it felt more natural to us as JavaScript engineers as well. We
kind of went full circle on that because we started out there and it wasn't meeting our needs, and we switched to classes because it met our needs at the time, and then TypeScript improved and we improved, and it kind of ended up back where we wanted to be.
We obviously, as you say, like we started off with a kind of a library called Compose in Dojo, which was an attempt to provide a functional kind of composition API. And it's not that we've got to a composition API now per se, but kind of that was the original kind of ergonomics that we felt would be the nicest way to achieve something. It couldn't be done with the TypeScript at the time in terms of the ergonomics and typings. So we moved to classes because it provided us what we needed at the time.
Possible.
In terms of like mixins, because we could use mixins to decorate behavior and decorate properties onto an interface that would then be typed for the author and the end user. So that was crucially important to us at the time. And then obviously TypeScript, even in the last 2 years, is it's the adoption and the love that TypeScript is getting. I think it's winning over kind of the majority of the community at the moment, well, as far as I can see. And I think that's right anyway. Personally, I think I've seen it used in kind of our customer projects at Sitepen, and how well it really helps with like a larger engineering team to and from our perspective is kind of like having to wrangle types to get something so that it works perfectly, or as close to perfectly for a user in a framework or a library. It can be kind of frustrating at times for us, but when we get it right and it just makes sense, then it really, really demonstrates the power of what TypeScript brings over, JavaScript in general.
Yeah, so I have two very different questions that I think we'll probably take the rest of the time we have. One is, like, do you think there's something we can do with TypeScript 4.1's like type string literals that they've added to maybe support a syntax beyond JSX maybe? And then the other question is sort of, if you're writing an application with React or Angular or something else, are there things you might do that would make it easier to eventually port an application to Dojo if you were like, well, I'm using this now, but maybe if I'm smart, I could make that transition easier when I'm ready to switch to Dojo?
It's a good question. I'll do the, I don't know is the first one, given with 4.1. That's my simple answer. We haven't.
Well, we've been experimenting with something a bit, right? Like the templates a little different than JSX, right?
You mean so that's hugely experimental, and that didn't require 4.1. That's something that Matt Gadd's been experimenting with forever, in terms of providing a mechanism for templating in Dojo to provide kind of that, I guess, even like to take it even one step further to lower those those barriers of entry, to make it so that people can use kind of similar. It will be powered by the same machinery under the hood, but it would provide you kind of that template language, that template syntax that users could build. And yeah, I mean, in the future, I think that's certainly something that's it's one of the big kind of ticket items that we want to get round to. I'm not sure it'll make 8, but I know for a fact it won't. But yeah, I mean, that's something that Matt's kind of wanted to kind of play with and get working, for a while. So I'm sure that will come back round. And what was the second question again?
So if you're writing an application now with React or Angular or something else, are there things you could do that like maybe make it easier to port your application to Dojo later? Besides like web components, but maybe just like architecturally, or are there things you're like, well, I've seen people do this in React or Angular, and that limits the portability of the product or the work you're doing?
I mean, I think the key thing is obviously like with Dojo, React, and Angular and Vue, they all have kind of their own like patterns, even if they're similar in concepts. So I think for me, converting kind of a React app using kind of the basic hooks would be pretty straightforward to Dojo. I mean, a lot of the time, if you squint at some Dojo code, if you're familiar with React, you'll kind of go, oh, it looks like React. We use JSX. We have things that don't have U's in front of them, but kind of are similar in a paradigm to hooks. So that's possible. I mean, Angular kind of is a different beast altogether. And I think, it would be a large effort to convert, most kind of, it's not hello world Angular apps. And I think the same is probably true of Vue to a lesser extent, just purely and simply, the patterns they use, single file components, like paradigm. It doesn't kind of.
Well, I haven't even looked at Vue 3 in any depth yet to know like what's different about that, but I understand it's pretty different than.
Yeah, I mean, it looked really good, from what I've seen, and I guess that's the thing. Is like, I mean, all the frameworks you mentioned are all great. The biggest goal that we have is not necessarily kind of that portability from like React or Vue or Angular. It's actually kind of, we want to kind of, as you said earlier, is Dojo 2 was such a different beast to Dojo Toolkit or Dojo 1 point whatever. And something we really want to look at is we really want to provide a better path for people who are using Dojo Toolkit today with their applications to migrate to Dojo 2. Oh, Dojo,
Yeah.
modern Dojo. Why did I say Dojo 2? Modern Dojo. Modern
Well,
Dojo.
it's so like we said the word Dojo 2 for so long, it almost
I
feels like
know.
Java 2 version 1.6, but
One
like,
of
you
the
know,
biggest
we're just,
mistakes we made is trying to have to
yeah.
fix where we put 2 everywhere in all of our documentation and all of our repos, and having to go through and remove all that.
I still find it sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we haven't quite got there yet. But so that's something that we really want to try and kind of smooth over and make more possible, because at the moment there isn't much tooling. We don't provide much guidance, and really and truly those are the kind of the applications and projects that, from a Dojo perspective, we want them to their first choice to be, migrate their app to Dojo progressively, like building and use modern Dojo, like without having to rewrite their entirety of their kind of 5-6-year-old app, which is, it's no mean feat anyway. So, and of course it's possible, given the right knowledge and the right, and time and engineers.
But everything takes time. Even
everything
sometimes
takes time,
some of the simplest things on the web take forever, or it feels like.
And if we can improve that migration path from Dojo Toolkit to modern Dojo, then that's a significant goal of kind of mine and Matt's at the moment.
For me, a lot of it's really easy when you're writing components to start to mix in like framework specific logic, like throughout the place, because it's easy, right? And so for me, it's sort of like if you write a component and you've got like 10 hooks and 20 other things and whatever, instead of splitting that out maybe as a single dependency into the component, then maybe it's easier to like start to migrate things over by sort of keeping, like Dojo does a pretty good job of this. Like Dojo uses underneath the covers like post CSS and CSS modules and Webpack and a few other things, right? But as a user of Dojo, you really don't care about those dependencies, which means that like if we need to migrate to something else besides Webpack, or we decide that like CSS modules aren't, or post CSS isn't the right package for that, and we want to switch to something else, it's pretty easy for us to do that. It should be pretty trivial for our users to upgrade, versus if we started to like use and leverage like every extension to post CSS out there, we'd be pretty heavily coupled to post CSS, and it would make it more difficult to allow that migration. So it's kind of the same thing. Like if you're like going really low level into all the innards of everything React might do everywhere in your code base, and similarly with Angular, like it's hard to decouple that, versus like if you've got kind of a clean separation of like, this is my components, they're pretty much aligned with standards, and I'm passing some data in, then it's pretty easy to swap things out, at least know where you need to swap them out.
If you've got kind of like your business, your logic, your wrapping components, and then you wrap kind of your leaf components that are kind of, I'd say dumb, but not dumb, but don't necessarily use any of kind of this React specifics, then absolutely, it does reduce kind of that surface area that you need to kind of address if you were to kind of transition from React or Vue to Dojo. Absolutely.
Yeah. Or in reverse, even for people who it's just like the point of frameworks isn't to lock you in, it's to like give you a solution, And so I think we're dude, that's been an hour. I can't believe that. Time's been flying by.
I've been watching the clock.
Awesome. Well, thanks for making the time. Thanks OpenJS Foundation for having us, and thanks everyone for your questions. And feel free to reach out to us on dojo.io or on our Discord channel. Cheers.
Absolutely. Cool.